September 27, 1942. Stalingrad, southern Russia. Somewhere on a German staff officer's situation map that week, someone picked up a red grease pencil, looked at a plain 4-story apartment block near the city's central square, and wrote a single word next to it in German military shorthand. Festung. Fortress, not a bunker, not a command post. An ordinary apartment building where factory workers used to live before the war, Feinhead, now marked on a field marshal's map, with the same word the Wehrmacht used for the heaviest fortified strongpoints in Europe. That map has survived. Historians still cite it today as one of the strangest pieces of paper to come out of the entire Eastern Front. Because by every rule that had made the German army the fastest conquering force in modern history up to that point, a building like this should never have earned that label. To understand why that single word mattered, you have to understand what the German army had already proven it could do. In September 1939, it took 5 weeks to conquer Poland. In May and June of 1940, it took 6 weeks to force France to the negotiating table, a country that had held the line against Germany for over 4 years in the First World War. By the autumn of 1941, German spearheads had driven roughly 800 kilometers into Soviet territory in a matter of months. Whole cities surrendered before the Wehrmacht's tanks had even fully encircled them. Speed was the doctrine. Keep moving, or keep the enemy off balance. Never let them dig in long enough to make you pay for the ground. And then, in the late summer of 1942, that same army reached a city on the Volga River, named after the Soviet leader himself. And something about the war changed shape entirely. Before I go further into what happened inside that one building, because what's coming is one of the strangest true stories of the entire war, I want to ask you something. If stories like this matter to you, the real ones, backed by real documents and real names, not the recycled versions you've probably already seen 10 times on this platform. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. This channel exists because people keep sharing those stories in the comments, and I read every single one. Now, back to Stalingrad. By September 1942, the battle for the city had stopped looking like anything the German army had trained for. This wasn't open country where armor and air power could win a battle in an afternoon. It was room-to-room, floor-to-floor combat that Soviet soldiers grimly nicknamed Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, a phrase German soldiers themselves coined and passed back up their own chain of command, because a war fought through sewers, stairwells, and collapsed walls didn't behave like any battle their doctrine had prepared them to fight. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov was 24 years old, a junior NCO in the 42nd Guards Regiment, 13th Guards Rifle Division. On the night of September 27, 1942, most of the officers above him in his own chain of command had already been killed or wounded in the fighting for the city center. That left Pavlov, a sergeant, in command of what began as a 4-man reconnaissance patrol with a single order. Retake a 4-story apartment building overlooking a square the Soviets called 9th of January Square, and hold it. He and his men crossed open, fire-swept ground to reach the building, cleared it of the German troops occupying it, and dug in. Within days, reinforcements arrived under Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, bringing the garrison up to somewhere between 25 and 30 men, a number that varies slightly across surviving Soviet records, but never rises much above a single understrength platoon, 25 to 30 men. One building, and for the next several weeks, elements of the German 6th Army, the same army that had marched into Paris without a fight 2 years earlier, would try, and repeatedly fail, to take it back. What happened inside that building, and what General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet commander defending Stalingrad, would later claim about exactly how much it cost the Germans to keep failing, is where this story turns from a single building's defense into one of the most quietly devastating symbols of the entire Eastern Front, late September 1942. Inside the building on 9th of January Square, Stalingrad. First thing Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev did after arriving with reinforcements was something no German staff officer studying the building from a distance could see. He turned an apartment block into a machine. Afanasyev organized his roughly 25 to 30 men into small groups, each responsible for a specific floor, a specific arc of fire, a specific set of windows. He ordered mines laid on every approach to the building. He had barbed wire strung around what was left of the perimeter. Machine guns went into the basement, the ground floor, and the roof, positioned so that no single German assault from any direction could avoid at least 2 overlapping fields of fire. An anti-tank rifle team was positioned to cover the square itself, because armor was the one thing that could, for theory, simply drive through anything smaller. Soviet engineers later dug a communication trench, connecting the building back to Soviet lines, which meant Pavlov's men could be resupplied and reinforced without ever crossing open ground under fire. A detail that, more than almost anything else, explains why a single platoon in a single building could outlast weeks of attacks that would have overrun almost any position without it. And, in the basement, through nearly all of it, civilians remained. Stalin had issued no evacuation order for the city's population, and Soviet command's calculation, brutal but explicit, was that a city with civilians still in it was a city Soviet soldiers would fight harder to hold. Families sheltered beneath the floors, where Pavlov's men fought for close to 2 months, through some of the most concentrated combat of the entire war. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, attacked the building repeatedly. Exact assault frequency varies across surviving accounts. Some describe near-daily attacks by infantry and armor through late September and into October, though it's worth being honest here. Fine. German archival records that survived the war do not fully corroborate the scale of continuous, large formation assault that later Soviet accounts sometimes described. And some historians have argued the popular version of the siege compresses and dramatizes what was, in reality, a smaller number of serious attacks, interspersed with longer periods of sniping, shelling, and standoff. That historical debate is real and worth knowing. What isn't disputed is the outcome. German forces tried repeatedly to dislodge a platoon-sized garrison from one building in the middle of a city they otherwise controlled. For close to 2 months, they failed. Every time German infantry or armor tried to cross the open square to reach the building, walked into the same problem the Wehrmacht had never really faced at scale before: a defended position with no single point of failure. Take out one machine gun, another covered the gap. Push armor across the square, and it drove straight into the anti-tank rifles' prepared line of fire, with no room to maneuver around it in the rubble-choked streets. The mines forced any assault into narrow, predictable lanes, which meant the defenders always knew, roughly, where an attack would have to come from before it arrived. General Vasily Chuikov, the Soviet commander in overall charge of the defense of Stalingrad, would later make a claim about the fighting for this one building that has been repeated in histories of the battle ever since, that the German army lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than it had lost taking the entire city of Paris in 1940. It's a striking comparison, and it should be read for what it is: a wartime commander's assessment, precise, not an audited casualty count, and precise German losses specific to this one building were never separately tallied in surviving records. But the fact that a Soviet general felt he could make that comparison at all, about one apartment building against one European capital, tells you something about how this fight was already being understood by the people who lived through it. Out of the platoon that held that building, only 3 men are recorded as having been killed in the defense: Lieutenant A.N. Chernyshenko and soldiers I. Chait and Ivan Sverin. A remarkably low number given nearly 2 months under continuous threat, though most of the survivors, including Pavlov and Afanasyev himself, were wounded at least once during the siege and simply kept fighting. By late November 1942, the building that had stopped a piece of the German Sixth Army for close to 60 days was about to become part of something much larger. A Soviet counter-offensive that wouldn't just relieve Pavlov's house, but begin closing a trap around the entire army that had been sent to take it. November 19, 1942. Soviet artillery opens fire along a 100-kilometer stretch of front northwest of Stalingrad, while Pavlov and Afanasyev's men were still holding their building, still fighting off assaults from the same German Sixth Army, occupying the rest of the city around them. from the Soviet High Command was quietly assembling something far larger than a single garrison's defense. It was called Operation Uranus, and it had nothing to do with retaking one apartment block. It was aimed at the army trying to take it. The plan was simple in concept and enormous in execution. Strike the weaker Romanian and Italian formations, guarding the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Armies that lacked the German Sixth Army's armor and anti-tank capability. Punch through them and swing two Soviet spearheads together behind Paulus's forces. On November 23, 1942, 4 days after the offensive began, Soviet units from the two fronts linked up near the town of Kalach, closing the ring. An estimated 250 fighting to 290,000 German and Allied troops, the entire German Sixth Army among them, were suddenly trapped inside a pocket they had spent months fighting to expand. Pavlov's house was still standing inside that pocket when the encirclement closed. The building that had spent close to 2 months absorbing German attacks was, in a strange twist of the war's geography, now sitting behind the very lines it had helped hold. No longer an isolated outpost, but a small, stubborn piece of a trap that had just swallowed an entire army. On November 25, 1942, Soviet counterattacking forces finally reached and relieved the building. The siege that had begun on September 27 was over, a defense that, depending on which exact dates a given historian uses for its start and its relief, is generally cited as having lasted approximately 58 to 60 days. The civilians who had sheltered in the basement throughout the fighting came out into a city that was, by that point, almost entirely rubble. Pavlov and several of his men were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor the country could give. He survived the war, was wounded multiple times during the defense but never evacuated, and went on to a long life afterward, retiring from the army as a lieutenant in 1946, later serving as a member of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic. He died in 1981, nearly 4 decades after the fighting that made his name a permanent fixture in the history of the battle. The Sixth Army he had helped stop was not so fortunate. Trapped, freezing, planned, and running out of supplies through the brutal winter of 1942–43, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus formally surrendered his forces on January 31 and February 2, 1943. The first time in the war a German field marshal had surrendered an army in the field. Of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad's surrender, only a small fraction, commonly cited as around 5,000 to 6,000, are believed to have survived Soviet captivity and eventually returned home years later, some not until the mid-1950s. So here's the honest answer to the question in this video's title. The German army captured cities fast for the same reason it had captured Warsaw, Paris, and hundreds of towns across the Soviet frontier in 1941. Its entire doctrine was built around speed, maneuver, and armor operating in open ground, where a defender who couldn't match that speed simply got overrun before they could organize a real defense. Stalingrad took that advantage away, forced the fastest army in the world into a fight measured in rooms and staircases instead of kilometers per day. A fight where a single understrength platoon, dug into one ordinary apartment building, could tie down and bleed a force that had needed only 6 weeks to knock France out of the war 2 years earlier. That is genuinely what unsettled German commanders about places like Pavlov's house. Not the size of the garrison, fact that their own doctrine, the thing that had made them nearly unstoppable everywhere else in Europe, simply didn't have an answer for it. Stalingrad would go on to claim, by most historical estimates, somewhere close to 2 million military and civilian casualties on both sides combined before the battle finally ended in February 1943, making it one of the costliest single battles in human history. Pavlov's house, one small piece of that staggering total, still stands in the rebuilt city today, one of the very first buildings restored after the war, a quiet monument to 58 days that a field marshal's own map once marked, in red pencil, as a fortress. If stories like this are why you keep coming back to this channel, the real record, the dates that check out, the parts that don't fit neatly into a clean narrative, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it's exactly what decides which story gets told next.